this demo, I am copying a portrait sketch of Gabriel Faure done by the amazing John Singer Sargent. It was done around 1889. One of my favorite ways to sharpen my drawing skills is to copy the drawings I admire the most by master artists. Copying the masters is a tried and true technique of classical art training. Here, what you see me doing is figuring out the negative space around the head of my subject. I have drawn lines around the original that I am copying from, and that box, each one of those lines touches one of the sides of his head. Then I measure that box using my pencil. I try not to use my ruler to make these measurements because then I really just train myself on how to use a ruler accurately. But by using the pencil, you really start to do more observational measurements. So here you see me measuring out the same exact size square. I am using the ruler to create straight lines. Once I have my square drawn and it is drawn at the same exact size as the drawing I am copying, I start to focus on the negative shapes. And here I'm showing you, I am coloring in that negative shape. Typically I don't color it in, I really just try to focus on that shape. But I'm coloring it in here to make it stand out a little bit more for you in the video. And what we're trying to do with this idea is get the shape of the back of the head, that corner of the drawing, as accurate as possible. It's much easier to draw negative shapes accurately than it is to draw subjects accurately. I'm continuing around the whole perimeter of the head this way, focusing on the negative shapes and not focusing on the head. We have so many preconceived ideas of what a head should look like that it's easy to start drawing what I think I'm seeing instead of what I'm seeing. Focusing on the negative spaces helps us be much more accurate, since we really don't have preconceived ideas of what negative spaces should look like. In essence, I'm drawing the outline of the head. In drawing, it is easier, even though it might seem counterintuitive, to draw the bigger shapes first and then dial down into the smaller shapes, smaller and smaller, and saving the final details for last. If we do the details too early on and then somehow they don't fit into the bigger shape, we're a little bit reluctant to erase them because we've spent so much time putting them in there. And it's really hard to make them come together and look like they adhere in a coherent drawing. It's a much better approach to start with drawing the bigger shapes first and getting down, drilling into the smaller and smaller shapes once you know your bigger shape is accurate. So here I'm fussing around, really paying attention to the size of those negative shapes. I'm actually drawing more slowly than it looks like in this video. One of the joys of drawing is the time you get to spend really observing. If you rush through this phase and you're in a rush to get the drawing done, you're really missing out on, first of all, how to create an accurate drawing. But second of all, the meditation and the joy of being able to just take time and really observe your subject and really study. I've sped up the video for you, so actually I'm drawing about twice as slowly as you see me drawing here. Really spending my time fussing around each little indent, angle, corner. I find this part of drawing relaxing, but I will admit it takes a while to get into that frame of mind of just enjoying this slow process. I'm fairly happy with the outline of the head now, and I think it's fairly accurate. So I'm starting to look at the shapes inside the head. Here you see me measuring from the corner of the eye to the edge of the face, just to make sure that my measurements are lining up with the drawing I'm copying. At this point, I'm still trying to resist the urge to think in terms of inventory drawing. In other words, drawing your inventory of details. Draw an eye, check. Draw a nose, check. Try to stay away from naming these things and just look at them as shapes, shadows, lines, angles. I find that the more I name what I'm drawing, the less accurate it is. Again, because we have so many preconceived ideas of how to draw an eye or how to draw a nose. Here I'm measuring the angle of that nose. It's amazing with faces, just being off by a slight bit on an angle of a nose will give you a completely different nose. Or being slightly off on the angle of the mouth will give the subject a completely different facial expression. So take your time and really look at these. The way I'm measuring those angles is I'm placing my pencil on the line, and I imagine my pencil to be the hand of a clock. And whatever number it's pointing to, I'm fairly able to copy over accurately onto my drawing. For example, the angle of the sketch we see here of that nose is probably, I would say, the hand of the clock is pointing to 10 o'clock. And that's how I drew it in. The mouth that you can barely see just underneath that mustache is pointing roughly to 4 o'clock. It's a simple way of figuring out angles, but it can be remarkably accurate. Before I get really dark, though, I'm putting in my lines. I'll build up to those darker shades towards the end. I really don't want to put dark lines in until I'm ready to commit. Sometimes in frustration, I see many students darken their lines, hoping that the darker they get, the more accurate they get. But it's really hard to erase them afterwards, and your drawing starts to be really messy and confusing to look at. So I really don't build up those values until I'm fairly confident about the line work. Here I'm looking at the slope of his forehead. And even if I'm not using my pencil, I am looking at that forehead and thinking, what angle is that at? The forehead is also easily defined by that negative space that it creates right above it. As I'm comfortable with the shape of his nose, now I'm starting to put in the shading. With the shading, at the very least, you should aim for 3 values. A light, which for this paper, I'm using the color of my paper as my lightest tone. A middle, and a dark. And I'm really going to wait until the end to put in the dark. So right now I'm just shading in anything that is not light. I'm shading it in at a middle value. Really trying to capture the shape of his eye. One thing I really like about this drawing that we're copying is the unfinished quality beneath the face. All of the detail work and expressive line is really in the face. Then the hair gets some detail, but not quite as expressive, and then the clothing is just implied. This variety of detail and line work and expression is exciting in a drawing. We get to see the different phases that build up a drawing. And in this way, also, the artist is directing us to what's most important, putting the detail where he wants the viewer to look. I'm erasing and redrawing the tip of that nose quite a bit. I'm really trying to get it just right. It's a small little feature. I mean, you can see how small it is even in my sketchbook. So it's harder to get accurate, all the little planes that change towards the tip of the nose. As you see my head bobbing back and forth, what I'm really doing is checking my drawing against the original, constantly going back and forth. If you find that you're staring at your paperwork and your drawing more than at the subject that you're drawing, you're probably making it up, either from memory or what you think you're saying. It's really important not to do that if we're drawing for accuracy. You want to spend almost more time looking at your subject than looking at your own drawing. Here I'm starting to draw in the shape of his hair. I'm following somewhat the line work of Singer Sargent, and that is one of the great things about copying master drawings is we're trying to also copy their line work, understand how they suggested hair. Certainly he didn't draw every strand. It's more sort of abstract hash marks of light and dark and middle values. And so I'm trying to copy those as well to really learn from the master. Here I'm measuring how tall or how far up the ear is from the bottom of my box. I want to be sure that things are lining up where they're supposed to be. I'm also paying careful attention to, for example, the back of his collar butts up against the back of his head at a certain point between his ear. And I want to be sure that my drawings are lining up the same way as the original. After spending so much time on the face, the back of the head, the hair, and the clothes seem to come together really quickly. Again, though, I'm not speeding up the process. I really am paying careful attention to where the shading goes. When we start shading a face, where we put the lights and darks really creates the form of the face and can change it drastically even if you have all your lines drawn in correctly. Shading tells us how light is hitting a form. So if we put shading in a different place than the original, you'll find that the form of his face, his features, will actually start to look very different. And I'm paying careful attention here to the angles of his shirt and his jacket. Even though they're very spontaneously drawn on the original, I still want to capture the right position. At this point, I'm even starting to really pay close attention to Singer Sargent's line work. Lines have a lot of expression, and if we drew the entire drawing with the same thickness and darkness all the way around, it would have more of an illustration or comic look. John Singer Sargent was a master at variety and line work. And by that I mean where the lines are thicker, where they're darker, where they're thinner, where they fade away, where they softly fade away, and where they abruptly end. I am more concerned about line quality once my drawing is farther along. Initially, I keep my pencil line work really light because I know that drawing is all a matter of putting a line down and erasing, putting a line down and erasing. So I want to keep the initial lines really light. So at that point, I'm not really worried about expressive line work. I'm more worried about getting the biggest shape in accurately, like you saw me do at the beginning. Once those shapes are in and I've started laying in the features and the smaller shapes within, I'm ready to start committing with my line work, getting darker where I need to, softening up, and looking at the expressiveness of lines. And that's the stage I'm at right now. Erasing is such a part of drawing, and I think that a lot of students come into it thinking that erasing means you're just making mistakes. But in drawing, sometimes you really do have to put a line down before you can measure if it is in the right place or not. You cannot figure out the rightness or the correctness of your lines just in your head. You have to be willing to put something down on paper and then correct it as needed. It's part of the process. This is really getting towards the final stages of my study, and I'm really starting to have fun. I feel like all the hard observations done, and now I get to play a little bit more with values. Where do I want to put in the darkest parts? Where do I want to put in the lightest parts? Putting in darks and lights is really fun. That's where things start to look three-dimensional. But for the way I like to draw, I really try to reserve that for the end. If I do a lot of this kind of work towards the beginning, it's really hard to decide to erase it later if I find that I was incorrect. So again, try to discipline yourself and do your line work, your measurements, and your block-ins all first before you start diving into values and details. The values and the details are fun, and the magic really starts to happen when you see it come to life like this. But it really is best if you can wait until you have your foundation done. The foundation is not as rewarding, it's just these odd light lines, but your whole drawing really hinges on that. I'm coming up to the last few marks on this drawing. I hope you've enjoyed this quick demo of copying a master drawing. And here is my final drawing.